Okay, if you've just joined us and you haven't done already, please introduce yourself in the chat and tell us where you're from so that we can, see where everyone's coming from. And looks like there are a lot of folks from from different municipalities around the state. I've noticed there are a couple of people from out of state, so welcome to our training. I hope you find something informational for you as well. A couple of housekeeping items. We would appreciate if you raise your hand if you have any questions. Gary will be able to take questions as he moves along through his PowerPoint so that you can have a conversation in real time. And without any other delay, someone from Canada. Hi, Lynn. It's very nice to have you down here in the States here. So so make sure that you're muted, and when you do have a question, we'll call on you and you can just unmute and turn on your video, and then we'll be able to address any questions you have. So again, welcome to our USIS webinar. It's the Keeping the Lights On, and we are very happy to have Gary Davidson, who is the Regulatory Affairs Principal at the New York ISO. He supports the ISO's communications and outreach efforts with state and federal regulators, as well as stakeholders in the public. So prior to joining Regulatory Affairs, he was the team leader for the New York ISO Strategic and Business Planning Group, overseeing the strategic planning process. And prior to joining the New York ISO, Gary worked for EDP Renewables, developing utility-scale wind farms in New York and New England. He was responsible for all aspects of project development, including site viability study assessments, environmental permitting processes, land acquisition efforts, grid interconnection, and competitive landscape assessment. And previous to that, he worked as a policy advisor and chief assistant to the chairman of the New York State Public Service Commission, where he co-directed development of the state's renewable portfolio standard, as well as its energy efficiency programs funded through the system benefits change. Gary began his career with the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, where he was responsible for media relations and communications activities. So although Kevin Lenahan was called away, we are very, very pleased to have Gary, who brings a multiple of experiences to this discussion. I think will truly just provide a lot of enhanced information that we really could appreciate. So Gary, if you would like to take over, I will be taking, keeping track of the questions as they come up. So there you go, David, or Gary.
Great, thanks, Joanne. So I haven't mastered Zoom as well as Teams. NYISO does a lot of meetings with Teams. So right now I can't see any raised hands or any of the folks. So yeah, if Joanne, if you could just flag when folks do have comments, I'm happy to stop and chat about any questions that come up as they come up. I'll try my best to fill in for Kevin Lanahan's shoes. He was unfortunately sorry he couldn't make it tonight, but was called down to Washington along with our CEO and a number of other CEOs and senior officials from ISOs around the country that will be testifying before Congress tomorrow on reliability. So kind of along the same lines of what we'll be chatting about tonight. Just to give a little bit of sense, I never know how familiar folks may be with ISOs in general, much less the New York ISO or RTOs. But we manage the bulk power system in New York State. We operate what we colloquially refer to as the grid. These are the higher voltage lines that are running from one region of the state to another. So not necessarily the lines that run through folks' neighborhoods, the distribution lines that, that you're probably most familiar with, that the utilities operate and administer. But we operate the bulk power system. That's those high voltage lines, and roughly 760 generation units that are connected to those lines, 11,000 or so miles of voltage of high voltage lines across the state, and roughly 440 or so different market participants that are actively participating in our market on a day-to-day basis. So moving on. I won't spend a lot of time talking about the mission and vision, but I do just want to point out the references to clean energy future and the most under the mission, and then within the vision, the reference to building the cleanest, most reliable electric system in the nation. That was a specific change that the board made to our mission and vision in the wake of the CLCPA. So it was a very clear acknowledgement on the board's part, and as an organization, that with the passage of the CLCPA, we are working towards that vision. So we're working towards that clean energy future that's been codified now in state law. So that was a significant change, from an organizational standpoint, not that long ago. Again, a little bit more about what we do. We're focused on the reliability of the power system. So we work with utilities across the state and with our brethren in other parts of the country, our neighbors in New England and the PJM Interconnect and in Canada, to study the system and maintain reliability, plan for new build out. We also operate the wholesale power markets or wholesale electricity markets. And these are really the primary tool that we see for driving reliability into the system. Our markets work to provide investment signals, long-term investment signals, and sort of operational, day-to-day operational signals for the market participants and the generators to follow. So it's really through those markets that we're attempting to operate the system in an efficient and reliable manner. We also have responsibility for planning the bulk power system. It's a significant effort, and it's really a multi-pronged effort. We'll talk about that in a little bit. There's a number of different planning activities that we engage in throughout the year, from reliability planning to public policy planning, and we'll talk about some of that in a bit. And then the last thing of note is what we're doing today. We view ourselves as an authoritative source on the grid. We work with data, and we try to use that data and present that information in a way that helps policymakers and stakeholders to shape their decisions. We're not a policy-making body in and of ourselves, but we do try to provide the data, the information that policymakers need to make decisions. We are not the only ISO in the country or on the continent, I guess, in this case. There are about nine similar organizations throughout North America. We are, though, the only sort of single state border-to-border ISO in the country. You take a look at California, it's also kind of referred to as a single state ISO, but they don't necessarily operate the entire grid within the state. There are elements of the grid that are outside the California ISO's purview. Even ERCOT, which is sort of, famously an electrical island unto itself, but ERCOT doesn't operate the grid, the full grid within the state of Texas. There are areas of Texas that are interconnected. And then other regions like New England, 6-state ISO, and PJM is I've forgotten how many states are in the PJM interconnect at this point. I think it was 14 or 17 at one point, but it's important. It's an important point to note there that the single state ISO aspect of the New York ISO is is pretty unique, and to some degree, it's worked very much to our benefit, particularly in terms of transmission planning. And we'll touch on that a little bit later. So we'll get back to that. Okay, so we are an independent body, an independent nonprofit organization, but we do have many bosses, I guess you could say. First and foremost, we're regulated by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. That's where we present filings. That's where we go for approval for planning activities. That's where we go for approval for market design changes. They are our primary regulator. New York State Public Service Commission certainly has a role. They do directly regulate certain aspects of the NYISO's financing primarily. But more importantly, when it comes to the PSC, is their role in state policy and their role in working with utilities around the state and sort of coordinating on that level. So while they're less of a direct regulator of the New York ISO, they're certainly a primary stakeholder and an organization we coordinate quite a bit with. And they do, in fact, actually set the reliability standards in New York. So, and those are standards that we're ultimately obliged to adhere to as well. North American Electric Reliability Corporation is effectively international, as it says, North American. It develops reliability rules essentially that everybody has to abide by. So all 9 of those organizations that I pointed to earlier have to abide by the rules that NERC puts forth. In addition to NERC, there's regional organizations, and we're subject to the rules and reliability requirements of the Northeast Power Coordinating Council. They also oversee reliability for ISO New England and parts of northeastern, or well, maybe it's southeastern Canada, I guess, but the folks to the north of us. And so on top of that, and this is again unique to New York, we have a state-specific reliability council, the New York State Reliability Council. And
Gary, there are two
yes.
questions. There are 2 questions when you have a chance. Is now a good time?
Terrific. Well, let me just wrap up with the Reliability Council.
Oh,
and then, yeah, I'll be happy to take questions. So the New York State Reliability Council, as the name implies, it develops reliability rules specific to New York and really very much specific to New York City's unique circumstances. It's a large, densely populated region of the country. The grid in that region is also fairly densely packed. And there are certain rules and requirements that are in place to protect reliability around New York City that don't really apply anywhere else in the country. So in that regard, in New York, we're always striving to adhere to the most rigorous reliability rules in the country. And I guess with that, Joanne, yeah, please let me know what questions folks have.
okay. Well, now I have, okay, I have 3. The first one was from Robert Szalski. Bob, did you want to ask the question yourself? If so, go ahead and unmute yourself and share your video. Okay. Well, maybe he can't. Let me see here. So, all right. Bob, can you?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Can you hear me now?
Oh, there you are. Okay.
I wasn't unable to unmute, so
Oh, okay.
with other people, there was no button here. I was my question was, I mean, since this is about reliability, how can we use New York's, massive hydropower from Niagara Falls and Messina and other places to provide the reliability for renewables, to provide backup to renewables, and also to enhance the transmission of renewable electricity throughout the state? That was my question, Gary.
Yeah, so well, we do today use hydro very much as a reliability resource. Hydro has has all of the characteristics that we sort of desire, and and in many ways has a lot of the characteristics that we'll need to balance the intermittency of wind and renewable resources. Hydro resources like Niagara can be ramped up and down fairly quickly in response to any fluctuations in renewable energy output. The challenge will be sort of building on that as we expand renewable resources in the state. We'll need more resources like that hydro resource for those kind of balancing. Right now, we refer to those to this notion of a dispatchable emission-free resource. Well, hydro could qualify certainly as a dispatchable emission-free resource. Like I said, it's something that can be controlled, ramped up and down, and made to do what grid operators need it to do. But there's only so much of it available to the system, and there's only so much ability to expand the hydro in New York. There is, and we'll get to a slide in a little bit, the opportunity to bring hydro from Canada. There's a line that's under construction as we speak that will bring hydro resources directly into New York City. And so that's one possible way of sort of expanding the use of hydro for balancing renewables. But really, we're going to need some other dispatchable emission-free resource, whether it's hydrogen or some other fuel. We at the NYISO don't necessarily know, but it's something that we're identifying in our studies in terms of we see this need out there, and we now need some cooperation, and the state is looking into how do we start to define what these dispatchable emission-free resources will look like, and how do we kind of start incentivizing them to enter service, enter the grid. So I don't know. Hopefully that was a sufficient answer to the question. I think the short answer is we're using hydro today to balance the system and maintain reliability, but we'll need a lot more of a similar resource to hydro in the future to meet those 2030 or 2040 goals.
Great, thank you, Gary. Bill Nowak had a question, so if you would like to unmute yourself and share your video, that would be great.
You may have to unmute him too.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. My button only showed up after you unmuted me.
Oh,
hello.
Yep. Hi, Bill.
Hi, thank you. Yeah, I was just asking about the map on the slide before this one. There are a number of states that are not part of ISOs and that are colored in gray there. I'm just wondering what happens with those states.
Yeah, good question. It's about a third of the country population-wise. So they're effectively, they continue to operate sort of in the old vertically integrated utility model. So this transition to ISOs and RTOs dates back to right around the year 2000, going back into the 90s. It was being studied quite a bit. And by the end of the 90s, early 2000s, many regions that were looking for opportunities to sort of leverage competitive markets to lower their costs were the ones that went forward and develop these RTOs and develop these competitive markets and planning processes. Some of the other regions of the country, they didn't necessarily see the value. If you look at the Northwest in particular, they benefit from a lot of low cost hydropower. There was less incentive for some regions of the country that already benefited from low cost power to really try to, like I said, leverage the competitive markets to help consumers with lower costs.
Am I understanding you right? Are you saying that the states or the areas that are within ISOs have separated out the distribution utility from generation, and the
Yes,
others?
largely that's correct. Yeah. So
Okay.
generation is owned by separate companies than the companies that own the wires.
Thank you.
Whereas the old vertically integrated model that's still being used in these gray regions. The utility owns the generation, the utility owns the wires, the utility owns everything from meter to meter.
Thanks.
Yep.
Okay. All right. Chris Carrick has a question as well. Chris, can you unmute yourself and start your video?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, I don't know how to start my video, but
Oh, okay, that's fine.
the question was, what would be an example of the standard that the PSC sets for the NYISO? Are those technical standards related to things like power quality, or are they more policies like the renewable energy standard?
Well, certainly those policies, renewable energy standard, clean energy standard, are those are state policies. They don't necessarily directly affect us in terms of regulating our activity, but they influence us in terms of what we believe we need to do in order for the state to achieve the goals. But really, in terms of direct regulatory authority over the NYISO, the PSC is primarily limited to certain financial transactions. If we incur debt for a certain period of time, for some purpose, whether it was we incurred debt to purchase the building that we operate out of, that was an action that had to be approved by the PSC. But in terms of our operations, they don't necessarily regulate that directly. They're regulating the utilities and their performance and their and their actions. That we deal with that through FERC in terms of abiding by FERC regulations, and if for instance we run afoul of regulations, it would be FERC that we would report to.
Just a quick follow-up then. In terms of setting timelines for things like interconnection studies for wholesale power producers that want to connect to the wholesale system, does the PSC set those timelines?
No, that is actually also FERC, and I think we'll talk about interconnection in a bit. That's a challenge that we're all facing. All of these organizations on the map are facing a similar challenge in terms of lots of proposals in interconnection queues, and really trying to sort through the best way to get through those projects efficiently. Help the proposals that have promise get through the queue, and sort of weed the proposals that are less promising out of the queue. But we'll talk about that in a little bit. We're actually working on a compliance filing with FERC in response to an order that they issued a few weeks ago, maybe a month ago now, on this very topic, on reforming interconnection processes.
Great, thank you so much.
Sure.
Okay, I have two questions from an anonymous attendee, so I'll read those for you. Do you see achieving New York's greenhouse gas emissions reduction and renewable energy targets, which were mandated by the CLCPA, as part of your role, the ISO's role?
Yeah, I think that was reflected in the mission statement. It's a bit it becomes a bit of a challenge because we also have the role of reliability. So when we get to some of the slides in a little bit, when we talk about some of our reliability planning study findings, we're really kind of drawing attention to the challenge that we're seeing in terms of we may need to take a second and slow down on the fossil fuel deactivations until we can get additional resources in place that will take place, take their place and provide the services that they provide. But we'll get to that in a minute as well.
Okay, and the next anonymous attendee, and you can let me know if you want to just hold off on that till the next till you get to that. But what barriers have there been in connecting renewables and storage to the grid, and what do you believe is needed to speed this interconnection process up?
Yeah, we'll get to that one. That's another good interconnection question.
Okay.
All
right. The next question is about storage. Is that something we want to hold off on as well?
Yeah, let me try to jump through a couple of slides first, because I do have a few slides that talk about storage and some of these other topics. So let me go through, but certainly feel free to bring those up if I don't answer the questions.
All right.
So just a little bit about where the material comes from that I'm going to be presenting. We've got a number of different reports that we put out. We put out reports all the time. Every report we put out as sort of a biannual report. So the first report on here, the System and Resource Outlook report, was issued at the end of 2022. And is being updated currently. May have been the end of 2021, I guess. So I'm sorry, it's right there in the title. 2021 is when we issued the System Resource Outlook. That's a report that really looks at future scenarios that will achieve CLCPA compliance, but identifies what are some of the missing ingredients, what are some of the investments that need to be made in order for that in order for those goals to be achieved. So it's identifying areas where transmission investment will be needed, and it's identifying areas. It's really identifying areas where we expect generation resources to be built out, renewable and solar, wind, renewable resources to be built out. And then identifying where is the transmission investment needed in order to deliver that resource to consumers. The second report we'll be talking about is this short-term assessment of reliability. This is a report that we update and we issue every 3 months. It's a quarterly report. Was issued in July of this year. Well, the next one will come out in, I guess, October. And we'll talk about this one. This is a very important report because it's looking at reliability in really the near term, looking at reliability concerns that might arise over the next 5 years, which from a grid perspective is almost immediate. It's difficult to sort of bring the solutions to the grid in that kind of a time frame. And then finally, the Power Trends Report is an annual publication where we sort of try to capture the state of the grid, trends that we're seeing on the grid, trends that we're seeing in terms of government action, and trends that we're seeing in terms of investment demand and the performance of generation. The Power Trends Report we issued in, I want to say, early June. It may have been late May, and we've actually just recently reissued it, because one of the problems of putting out an annual report is that you have to have a deadline at some point, and no matter when you make that deadline, there's going to be some big developments that happen immediately thereafter. So sure enough, in preparing Power Trends this year, we knew we would be issuing the second quarter STAR report, we knew that it would be identifying a reliability concern. And so we didn't necessarily want Power Trends to hang out there for a year, ignoring that fact. So we did reissue. We issued it in June and then reissued it again following the issuance of the Q2 STAR report in order to address some of the findings that were identified in that report. And really key themes, key findings in the Power Trends document. We are seeing change on the grid. It's something that we often talk about, the grid of the future, the grid in transition. And it seems sort of conceptual, but we're seeing it happen. We're seeing now in our interconnection queue. We're seeing it in load forecasts. We're seeing electrification programs start to drive demand from the building sector, from the transportation sector. We're seeing fossil fuel units retire in sort of record numbers in response to DEC peaker rule in particular. But we've also seen fossil fuel units exit our interconnection queue in response to challenges that they would have on the permitting side. So, we're witnessing sort of this transition, sort of a close, up close and personal, and sort of identifying through Power Trends what some of the challenges are that we're finding. And first and foremost is that last bullet point that reliability margins on the grid are really shrinking. And we'll jump into why that is. If you look at the exit and entry of generation on the grid, if you looked at it over the course of the last 20 years, it would be relatively stable. You'd see, I think the numbers were about 12,000 plus megawatts of generations entered the grid since 2000, and roughly 11,000 or so megawatts have exited. That trend is really kind of reversing and accelerating, though, in the last 5 years since the last 4 years since the issuance of passage of the CLCPA. We're seeing, like I said, the fossil fuel units are deactivating. We've deactivated now more than 4,700 megawatts of generating capacity since 2019. And we've only added 2,034 megawatts in that same time frame. And there's some differences between what's exiting and what's entering. What's exiting is, like I said, largely fossil fuel units, largely downstate. Many of them peaker units that were relied on for high demand periods. And what's entering the grid is largely renewable resources, largely upstate, away from the load. And so there's sort of an imbalance in terms of the numbers, and then there's also an imbalance in terms of the services that these resources can provide. And that's where we come to the conclusion that at some point these reliability margins are getting thin, and ultimately reach that conclusion in the Q2 STAR report. Quick snapshot, though, of what our fuel mix looks like. This is energy actually produced, so not generating capacity, but what actually gets produced and pumped onto the grid. The large donut in the center is a statewide pie chart looking where you can see a fairly diverse fuel mix. There's quite a bit of dual fuel resources. Those are largely natural gas and oil fired units that are downstate. We still have nuclear capacity that's largely upstate, and you can see the rest of the mix in there. What you see on the right-hand side of the chart, though, is when we start breaking the fuel mix down, breaking the grid down on sort of an upstate and downstate basis, where upstate, the upper right pie chart represents everything sort of north and west of Albany. Downstate is everything sort of including the capital region and south. And you can see sort of a stark difference in terms of fuel mix. The non-emitting resources are almost exclusively in the upstate region, whereas the downstate region is really reliant almost exclusively at this point on fossil fuels. That chart has changed a bit in recent years with the loss of Indian Point. Indian Point had provided a chunk of non-emitting energy to downstate region, but with the closure of that unit, it's effectively at this point, from the bulk system perspective, it's effectively at this point been replaced with fossil fuels. I would point out this doesn't take into account behind the meter solar, and so that's a significant resource. If you look at the large pie chart, it indicates we have 110 megawatts, or no, I'm sorry, that's gigawatt hours. We'll talk about solar capacity in a minute. This is just a snapshot of where we think demand is going at this point. It's been relatively flat. Demand from the grid has been relatively flat for the past few years. But like I said, we're seeing now the effects of electrification programs in particular. And what we've done here is take a few different scenarios and looked at where load is likely to go based on those scenarios. The baseline forecast is what we figure is the most likely outcome. A high demand policy scenario assumes that we achieve all of the policy goals in terms of electrification and other aspects of the CLCPA and other clean energy policies. And the lower policy demand, which sort of layered on top of the baseline, is just a different way of achieving those policy goals. So it assumes that we achieve the policy goals, but for instance, we don't necessarily have all plug-in electric vehicles. Many of the non-emitting vehicles would be hydrogen fueled. That's one way that we're sort of looking at these scenarios to try to figure out how likely are we to see demand on a higher end versus on the lower end. And it just so happened in this instance, it's kind of unfortunate that the lower demand policy scenario effectively lays right on top of the baseline scenario. But that baseline forecast scenario does not assume full compliance with the CLCPA. And that's something that we always are factoring into our load forecasts when the states issue a policy, whether it's the RPS or the Clean Energy Standard, energy efficiency goals. There's always a lag, and that's not a criticism of the state. It's just that's the nature of setting goals and then working towards those goals. There's almost always a lag between those two. And so that baseline forecast sort of accounts for some of that lag where we assume we're not going to fully comply with the CLCPA, but we will make progress towards it, and that'll have an impact on demand on the grid. So you can see for the next few years, it's potentially, the demand remains relatively flat, but we're going to see that grow as electrification starts to take hold.
Gary, there was a question here on the previous slide, which was, the pie charts. What is included in other renewables? There's
other renewables is largely landfill gas. There may be some other resources in other renewables, but I think it's the majority of it is landfill gas.
Okay, great, thanks.
So this information came out of the System and Resource Outlook report I mentioned earlier, where we sort of look at how do we achieve the CLCPA requirements? How do we get to 70% renewable by 2030? How do we get to a zero emitting grid by 2040? And some of the key findings of that study were we'll need about 20 gigawatts of new generation in service within the next 7 years in order to meet the 2030 goal, the 70% renewable energy by 2030. For perspective, we've added, I think I mentioned earlier, we've added only about 12 gigawatts of new generating capacity to the grid in the past 20 or so years. So that's a significant acceleration in terms of developing new resources. By 2040, we'll need roughly 111 to 124 gigawatts of new resources. Not all of that would be renewable. Some of that would be these DFRs that I referred to, this dispatchable emission-free resources. But again, for perspective, today we operate a system with roughly 37.4 gigawatts of generating capacity. We'll need to more than triple that in order to build up the resources that are necessary to provide energy, reliable energy, on a sort of a 24/7 basis by 2040.
Okay, Gary, I have a couple more questions
Yep.
that come up about your forecast scenarios.
Mhm.
Do the NYISO forecast scenarios match the Climate Action Council scenarios in the scoping plan?
The high policy scenarios, well, when you say do they match, I don't know if they match, but they assume compliance with the CLCPA. So like I said, they assume the carbon reduction goals are met. They assume the electrification goals are met. They assume that effectively that the CAC's scoping plan is executed as it's designed. Whether or not when we talk about some of these numbers, there are some differences between what we think and what the CAC put out in terms of generation capacity needed. I think they had a lower capacity number. I think they believed that the number for capacity would be lower, but the overall energy consumption or use in 2040 would be greater than the scenario that we've identified in our study. So there are some differences, but the key aspect of these scenarios, the policy scenarios anyway, is that we are assuming compliance with the clean energy policies with the CLCPA. Again, that baseline forecast is the only one that's not assuming that.
Thanks. John, I know you asked that question. If you could unmute yourself, let us know if that answered your question. And also, I know you had another question in the Q&A, so I thought you could just take care of both.
Hi there, John Shabako with Aztec Geothermal. And a couple thoughts. One is, it does seem to me that we certainly need to limit peak, and that's driving a lot of this. And so there's certainly network geothermal is being experimented with the utilities to try to do it on a broader scale, which would be a much higher efficiency building electrification. Do you have scenarios that, or certainly algorithms or something where we could try to plug in a more broad deployment of electrification at higher efficiencies? I guess it's the underpinnings of what's your electrification assumption that drives, the needing 3 or 4 times, which I don't begrudge. I'm just wondering what the assumptions are that drive the generation capacity needs to be that many multiples greater.
Yeah, so I know it's not just the buildings,
Sure, of course,
and the heat pump technology. There's also the transportation.
Transportation,
side of things. In addition to industrial load. I guess I don't know, John. I'm not sure I'm able to answer your question in terms of some of the specific assumptions in terms of adoption rate, for instance, of geothermal, either geothermal or air source heat pump technology. There were some conversations we had with NYSERDA about the likelihood of needing backup sources to air source heat pumps, and that may be a source. In fact, now that I'm saying it, I think that it's coming back to me that maybe one of the sources of differences between our assumption of peak and what the CAC put out, in that I think our assumption believes that there's a greater need for backup backup heat in addition to, say, an air source heat pump. So,
Sure.
and in keeping with the requirement of non-emitting, I think our assumption is that that backup is an electric baseboard heat.
Yeah, but we're all on the same team on that. You know, I'm not I just want to know what your assumptions are, because the ground source, we wouldn't need that backup.
Yeah.
And we wouldn't do the other thing that, and I know that you don't try to implement technology, you know, make technology suggestions. You're just kind of pointing out, you know, if we continue down this road, we will crash. But it does seem like there may be a little more interplay on solutions that we could get the ISO engaged in, like ground source heat pumps or smart meters in buildings, just something to limit the demand to avoid, you know, either a perpetuation of fossil fuels to try to keep the reliability up, or massive expenses. You know, both are undesirable.
Well, we do have one aspect of our markets is a demand response component. Historically, it's been sort of a reliability program, what we refer to as the SCR, or special case resources. It's effectively demand response that we activate on sort of a day ahead notice. If we think that reserves will get too low, if we think the reliability margin is going to be thin, we'll activate a demand response. Going forward, and we're working on this actively with FERC right now, is we're implementing market rules to better help aggregated resources do the kind of thing that you were talking about, you know, adjust their demand in response to conditions on the grid and price signals on the grid. In terms of how that might benefit geothermal or any of the electrification technologies, I guess I don't know if I could offer anything more at this point, but
Yeah,
certainly
it does seem like we certainly need feedback from the ISO on kind of where things are trending, and then even residential buildings. I mean, the electrical impact of millions of either smaller buildings is just going to increase so much in the winter between cars and heating and hot water, that it just seems like it needs to be managed on a per building basis. And then, but certainly getting signals from the ISO about where that's going, and then having smarter buildings would make all the difference in the world. And then certainly efficient electrification, like a ground source system that won't go into a backup or auxiliary state, obviously is another component. All right, thank you.
thanks.
Thank you, Chris or John and Gary. And just a couple, why would the NYISO not model a scenario in which it meets the CLCPA mandates? And I think you addressed that already, but.
Right. The two scenarios, the high demand policy scenario, lower demand policy scenario, do both assume that we meet those requirements.
Okay.
It's just the baseline scenario, for reasons like I said, based on how we're tracking programs and whatnot, we long recognize that there is sort of a gap between policy goal setting and achieving of that goal. So it's just really a reflection. The baseline is really just a reflection of what we think is more likely to happen.
Okay, great. All right, another question from Diane. I can't pronounce the last name, Kurzak, maybe. Diane, if you would like to unmute yourself, and you can ask his question.
Hi, thank you.
Sure.
I just wonder how many gigawatt hours are in the queue waiting for interconnection, and how close would that bring us to the goals, and how long would it take?
So right now there is more capacity proposed in the interconnection queue than exists on the grid in New York. I think it's 117 gigawatts, or 117,000 megawatts of proposals. That includes 55 offshore wind proposals for roughly 60,000 megawatts of offshore wind. So how close will that bring us? Well, that would, you know, if all of those proposals were actual projects and got built, then that would be, you know, that would roughly get us there, you know, according to our own study, in terms of, at least in terms of an outright capacity number. Still need to worry about some of the performance of the resources. But the thing about the interconnection queue is that not every proposal is destined to be a project. So I mentioned 55 different offshore wind proposals for roughly 60,000 megawatts of offshore wind. The goal for the state right now is 9,000 megawatts of offshore wind by 2035. And what a lot of offshore wind developers are doing is submitting multiple proposals. There's not just there are not really 55 projects in our offshore wind projects in our queue. There are 55 different iterations of a number of projects, where developers are essentially trying to find what's the best configuration for my project to connect to the grid. So it's a hard answer to offer in terms of, you know, how, you know, does everything in the queue solve the policy goal? Well, in theory, I suppose it could, but everything in the queue isn't really, like I said, destined to become an actual project on the ground. Developers use our interconnection queue to study their proposals and sort of, you know, refine them and put together what they ultimately hope is the best project.
Did that
Okay,
answer
thank
your
you.
question, Diane?
Yeah, that does. Are you going, can I just ask one more? Are you going to prioritize the applications in the queue that are downstate to shore up what's needed down around New York City?
Yeah, we really can't do that. That's per our tariff. We can't prioritize proposals over another. There's sort of a process that we have to follow as developers submit proposals. That said, we have sort of we have other efforts underway that are targeting the reliability concern that we have in downstate. If you think of our interconnection queue, these are largely proposals for developers that are, you know, it's their own ideas. They're coming up, they're looking at price signals and trying to come up with their own ideas as to where to propose a project. We have other processes that I'll talk about in a minute when we identify a reliability concern, like we have in New York City, we use other means to solicit solutions for that problem. And one of the challenges that we'll face in trying to address our sort of near-term New York City problem is getting getting new resources available to the grid in time. And you know, the interconnection queue is part of that. Permitting is also part of that, and there are again a number of other challenges as well. But let me jump. I'll just speak to this one real quickly, just to say that as a result of all this electrification that we've talked about a little bit, particularly building electrification, New York, we expect the New York grid to switch over from a summer peaking system where air conditioning is driving demand on the grid largely in the summer months to a winter peaking system where building heating systems and to some degree electric vehicles are driving demand on the grid in the winter months. So that's something that we expect can happen as early as the mid 2030s, and you know, may not be as linear as it appears on this chart. There may be, you know, some years where it's a summer peak and the next year we have a winter peak and go back to a summer peak, but the general trend is there that this electrification will push the system into a winter peaking system, and that has other consequences from an operational and planning standpoint. I mentioned a while back, I pointed out the solar that we had on the grid, and it's only roughly about 150 megawatts of solar of grid scale bulk system solar that we have operating through the NYISO. which pales in comparison really to what we see in the behind the meter solar area. Behind the meter solar, as of the end, there's a goal in New York by 2030 to achieve 10,000 megawatts of behind the meter solar. As of the end of 2022, that we were already at about 4,200. I just saw a report earlier today that pegged the current behind the meter capacity at about 4,800 megawatts. So certainly that's a resource that's growing significantly. If you look at that collectively, 4,800 megawatts of behind the meter solar, that's larger than any single generator that we have on the grid. So collectively, all of these behind the meter resources really do have an impact on the grid. And so what this chart is showing is the peak day from last summer and the peak day from last winter, and how solar performed on those days. So you see the blue line, the dark blue line is the summer demand, summer load on a peak day in, I forget when it was, but probably in July of last year. And then on top of that, that yellow shaded area is all load that's being supplied directly by behind the meter solar generation. So you can see, had that resource not been there, we would have had to dispatch quite a bit more resources on the grid, quite a bit more, whether it's natural gas or other resources in the summer months. Well, in the summer months, most likely natural gas. In order to meet that demand. But the solar was there. The solar was able to sort of shave off the peak during the midday. And if you look at the winter, similar effect. Obviously, there's less sun in the winter, so you get less output for a shorter duration. And really, what you see in the winter is one of the concerns that we have, sort of long term, as we become a winter peaking state. Is that by the time the system starts to peak in the winter months, that solar resource is really non-existent. The sun's already set, so there's no ability for that resource to really kind of support the system at that point. We need other resources, whether it's renewables or as I mentioned, the dispatchable emission-free resource that can be dispatched and supplant that output that's waning as the sun goes down and as load's climbing.
Gary, there was a question, if you could, in the middle of the bottom of your screen, if you could hit the hide button so you could see the bottom of the
yeah, sorry.
of the slide. Okay, thank you. And then Chris Carrick has his hand up. Do you want to unmute yourself, Chris, and go ahead and ask your question?
Yeah, just a quick question. The behind the meter solar figure here includes community solar, right? It's not just rooftop.
Yes, yeah. Behind the meter, it's largely rooftop, but particularly on Long Island, there's a number of multi-megawatt installations that are still considered behind the meter, and community solar would also, from our perspective, would also be considered a behind the meter solar resource.
Okay, that's what I thought. Thanks.
Yeah.
And Gary, there was another question in the chat that's related to that. Then some utilities are providing special contracts for EV charging, allowing them to dispatch the demand during nighttime charging. So is this part of your planning at the ISO?
Well, that's retail rate design, and so that's outside of our purview. We have our rates sort of do that naturally. Wholesale markets, sort of the price in the wholesale market fluctuates on a 5-minute basis based on the conditions of the grid. So we're always sending a sort of a real-time price signal, and obviously, if it's a higher price, it's a signal to not plug your EV in, and if it's a lower price, it's a signal that you may want to plug it in. But what those utilities are typically doing is sort of leveraging that wholesale signal and reflecting it at the retail level. So I know Con Ed in particular has some programs like that in place where it's almost, if not free, it's almost free to charge an EV overnight because of the nature of the system down there is that they would really rather have customers using some electricity overnight to keep their load shape flatter. So that's something that we look at from a planning perspective in terms of what's going to be the impact of electric vehicles. We'll run scenarios where we assume people just plug their vehicle in and charge whenever they want, and we'll look at scenarios that are more what we call managed charging, where we assume that people are going to charge their vehicles in response to some sort of a price signal from the grid, so that they'll charge in off-peak hours, for instance. So we try to tease that out through our load forecasting studies, but it's not something that we directly incentivize consumers to do.
Okay, great, thanks. There was a related question from John Rath regarding that. So John, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Sure, thank you. It has to do with the winter peak you just mentioned. And have you considered the value of thermal storage to offset that winter peak?
So we are a technology neutral organization. So we're certainly looking at storage and aware of developments in thermal storage, but in terms of in terms of planning for a specific technology, that's kind of outside of our purview. What our focus is really in when we look at what a load shapes look like in these winter peaking days, is to really kind of identify what are the characteristics from generation that we need to get through those days. Do we need long duration resources? Can we get through with short duration resources, some more conventional battery storage? So our goal really is to sort of identify the needs and help policymakers and investors make those kinds of decisions about what technologies will fit those needs.
Thank you.
Gary, I'm looking at the time. Do you want to go through the rest of your slides before taking any more questions? I don't know how much more you have.
Yeah, let me see if I can get through a few more anyway. I'll try to skip over some of them if
Well, don't skip over anything important, but I just want to make sure we had enough time to get through it all.
I'll just talk briefly about this. We track not just wind generation in New York, but also what we refer to as curtailment. At certain times, transmission system gets congested to the point where we need to direct wind generators to back off on their production in order to sort of preserve the reliability of the system. So we've over time we've kind of gradually increased the amount of energy that we produced from wind resources, but we've also noticed sort of an uptick in curtailment as well. The most recent year, 2022, is probably an anomaly because there's a lot of transmission construction activity going on. So it would be interesting to see what the 2023 number looks like. But I just wanted to point that out, that when we start talking about transmission investment, it's really to try to, one of the reasons that we're doing that is to get at this issue of maximizing the potential of the wind resources that we're developing in the state. And here we are at the transmission map. This is a really busy map. And when I mentioned earlier that there's some value or benefit of the NYISO being a single state ISO, it really kind of comes through in this map. Want to draw your attention to the yellow highlighted lines on this map. These are lines that were identified through our public policy transmission planning process, which is quite a mouthful to say, but this is a process that we put in place in response to a FERC order that directed us to have a planning process that would help states identify opportunities for transmission investment that might be needed to solve or to meet state public policy goals. And so this process, in a nutshell, we work with the Public Service Commission They identify public policy needs on the grid, and we run solicitations, solicit projects from developers to implement those solutions. And then the cost for those projects then gets recovered through our tariff from all customers in the state through our tariff. So real quick, the yellow line on the western side of the state, the Western New York Public Policy Transmission Need, was the first project that the PSC identified. That went through our process. That project's already been built and is in service right now. The second and sort of third, it's technically, I think, two different projects, but sort of looks like one project, this AC Public Policy Transmission Need that runs from Utica to the lower Hudson Valley. That was the second one identified by the Public Service Commission. We again solicited proposals for that project, selected winners, and those projects should be completed by the end of this year. The third need that the PSC identified is down on Long Island, where they've identified a need to reinforce the grid from Long Island to the rest of the state to enable at least 3,000 megawatts of future offshore wind development to move off of Long Island into the rest of New York State. We are currently soliciting proposals for that project right now. And I think by the end of this year, we'll have a recommendation for our board to select a project for that need. And then the fourth public policy need that the PSCA just identified earlier this year, a couple of months ago, is the New York City offshore wind transmission need. And that is effectively to try to coordinate the delivery of multiple offshore wind facilities into New York City. It is effectively to try to run a line from New York City out into the ocean that potentially multiple wind farms could connect to and deliver power into the city. That need was just identified. We're still going through the order, trying to make sure we understand it, working with our stakeholders to make sure they understand it. But that'll be a significant project as well. I think that one isn't expected to be online until after 2030, so long time frame for that one. Now, in addition to our public policy transmission planning process, there's a number of other projects going on to develop transmission. Chippy, the clean Champlain Hudson Power Express is the project I mentioned earlier that's being built to deliver hydro power from Quebec directly into New York City. It's under construction right now and should be online by 2026. And we're really hopeful that that's online by 2026 because it has some reliability consequences that I'll get to in a minute. And then lastly, a couple of other projects that are under construction. The Smart Path Connect project is under construction by NYPA. The PSC designated NYPA to build out that corridor to expand capacity to deliver hydro from Canada and wind resources from the North Country. And then last but not least, Clean Path New York. Similar to Champlain Power Hudson Express, the idea behind that line is to deliver zero emitting electricity directly into New York City. The Clean Path New York proposal is to sort of collect those resources from upstate wind, solar, and other resources and deliver that into the city while also balancing it with a pump storage facility there. And I forget the name of the town, but that project is relatively early stages in terms of development. I think its permitting application was just accepted at the PSC. It's in our interconnection queue, but it's still relatively early stage, certainly compared to the Champlain Hudson project. And then I think if I can get through this slide, then I'd be happy to take a number of questions. I do have a few other slides after this, but I think this slide kind of covers what those slides also talk about. I mentioned at the start of our discussion the Q2 star reliability finding. Just to back up a step, we used to study the reliability of the grid on sort of an every other year basis. We would issue a reliability needs assessment 1 year, follow it up with a comprehensive plan the following year, and then the next year we would kick that process off again and issue a reliability needs assessment. We're still doing that. But one of the things that we felt was important in order to sort of respond to the changes on the grid and sort of the speed of the changes on the grid was to start taking shorter term snapshots of reliability. So these reliability studies are coming out every quarter, like I mentioned earlier. They're looking out 5 years. The RNA looks out 10 years, so it's a longer outlook that we take on those every other year on that every other year basis. But every quarter, we're looking out over the next 5 years to see if the changing resource mix or the changing grid is going to remain reliable. And so in July, we issued the Q2 report. And we found, in this case, a transmission security need. And what that means is effectively we're unable to deliver as much as 446 megawatts to New York City at certain times during peak periods, based on our modeling of the system. So we're nearly 500 megawatts short of meeting what we would expect to be peak demand in New York City. And that's only less than 2 years now away. And beyond that finding, I mentioned how important Chippy is to reliability. Chippy's supposed to come into service in 2026. If it doesn't, then that reliability need that we've identified in 2025 doesn't really go away. It doesn't go away until Chippy comes into service. And so on the one hand, that makes, assuming Chippy comes in as scheduled, that makes this need that we've identified in 2025 sort of a short-term need, a relatively short-term need for 1 year until we get Chippy in service. But then again, on the other hand, the margin doesn't go up tremendously, and so it starts to erode. We're going to need additional resources beyond Chippy to maintain that reliability in the long run. And then, as if that news wasn't necessarily bad enough, we take a look at the statewide system margins in this study as well. And while it wasn't part of the core baseline assumption in the study, one of the scenarios that we looked at is what happens if some of the load associated with these large economic development projects that the state has committed to comes onto the system. So Micron is an example that I think many folks are familiar with. That's a multi-hundred megawatt at its full build out will be multiple hundreds of megawatts of demand on the grid. And there are other, in addition to Micron, there are others, the bit mining type operations that are entering the grid and demanding energy. And so when we see those load resources interconnect, if we assume that they do interconnect to the grid, then we find ourselves about 150 megawatts short of supply from a resource capacity standpoint. So, a resource adequacy standpoint. In other words, we'll be roughly 150 megawatts short of meeting demand during peak conditions on a statewide basis as well. I'll skip this. It's just kind of a visual to give you a sense of lines below zero are not good, is what the gist of those charts are. But so what are we going to do about the reliability need? Well, we're already taking steps. We've already solicited solutions from both the responsible utility, in this case it's Con Edison, as well as market solutions. So developers of any stripe really can offer ideas on how to resolve those needs. We've gone through with stakeholders what exactly that need is, and sort of now turn it over to them to propose ideas. We'll evaluate those proposals. But the biggest challenge that we think we'll have is in addition to finding a resource that can meet the need, it's getting that resource available to the grid in time to meet the need. And so there's a very real possibility that we may need to retain certain peakers. One of the things that's driving the reliability need is that the DEC's peaker rule will require a number of generating units in the city to either outright deactivate or at least not operate during certain months of the year, the summer months of the year. And when that happens, that's when we run into this reliability margin issue. So the solution, the unfortunate solution may be that we need to keep those peakers on until some other resource is available to the system to solve that need. And I think that brings me to just about the end. If folks have additional questions, I'd be happy to take them.
Okay, let me just go through some of these. So one is, if Chip is late, Chippy, would the DEC have to relax those rules about the power plants? And I think you did mention that. So do you have anything to add with that?
Bear with me. So yeah, if I'm sorry, if Chippy is late, what was it? I missed that. I was trying to clear my screen out there.
Relax its rules about the peaker plants. Would they
Oh,
have
so
to-
so the thing about the DEC's peaker rule is that it's built into the rule itself. The peaker rule identified the NYISO as having the authority to designate peakers that would need to be retained. We're in communication with the DEC about this on a pretty regular basis at this point. But so the peaker rule itself contemplated that there could be there could be a conflict between the desire to eliminate the emissions and the reliability of the grid. And so it did allow for the NYISO to designate for a limited period certain peakers that would need to be retained beyond the initial retirement timeframe.
Great. All right, so then there was another one up here. Let's see. Okay, so is the ISO considering innovative storage tech like thermal, pumped hydro, and gravity? I think we addressed that earlier, did we not?
Yeah, I mean, we would consider any and all resources. But again, we're not necessarily the ones designating. This is the technology to use in this instance.
Great. What are the biggest reliability challenges you see in the western part of the state?
I think it's that possible load growth that we talked about. A lot of those economic development projects are located in central and western New York. So there is that sort of thinning resource adequacy margin, and that could be exacerbated by electrification at some point. But I think it's those large loads really that are sort of the primary risk.
Okay. All right, I'm going to go through this a little bit from the top. If your questions are not answered, we will get those answers for you and distribute them. What do you believe is needed to speed the interconnection process up? That was from
so we've been working on that for quite a bit at this point. I mentioned that FERC issued an order a few months back, essentially directing us and other ISOs like us to file compliance plans that will that they think will accelerate the process. Some of it involves firming up timeframes and deadlines, and we think there's some validity to that, albeit that when you get into New York City, a deadline for a deadline for upstate New York may not make as much sense as a deadline for New York City. That's just a more complicated system to try to interconnect resources into. But so we've been adding resources both internally and technologically speaking. We have a portal that is available for developers in order to access information about their proposals that are in the queue, in order to provide us information that we need from them in order to process their proposals. We've added customer service representatives that are dedicated solely to responding to interconnection questions. And I think the number I heard was about 1,000 of them so far this year. And we've added engineers. We've added interconnection engineers to simply bring more, kind of more muscle to the effort. Some of it is going to be just brute force. We need more people. We've got plans for additional interconnection engineers hiring for next year as well. So some of it is bringing more people to the process. Some of it is finding some redundancies and things in the process that are slowing things down, maybe unnecessarily. Some of it might be looking at some of the flexibility that we offer to the developers. I mentioned there's 55 different proposals for offshore wind that we're looking at right now. Each one of those proposals requires the same level of study. And that historically that's been great. We can, developers submit a proposal, they provide the funding for us to do the study. So however many they wanted to do, that was fine. They were the ones trying to develop the project, so we were happy to help them identify the best location. But at some point, when the queue gets as large as it is, maybe we need to look at some of that flexibility. And it doesn't make sense for one developer to have 4 different proposals for one project. It's hard to say no, it doesn't make sense, because that developer is trying to find the best project, and we have at the NYISO we have an interest in making sure that projects tie in where it makes sense, as opposed to connecting on the grid where we're going to end up curtailing an offshore wind farm too much. So it's a difficult answer to provide quickly. We're putting together, I'm sure, a massive filing to FERC that will explain how we're doing this in excruciating detail. But to some degree, it's going to be a matter of bringing resources in, adding some people, looking at the process and eliminating some redundancies, and then looking at the process to see how do we balance flexibility with the need to move proposals along through the queue.
Great, thank you. This one I think you already answered. Which regions of the state do you see as in need of the most generation in addition to New York City?
Yeah, well, first and foremost, it's certainly New York City. We've historically, there's always been really a surplus of power upstate. It wasn't too many years ago when I was talking to folks about all the excess power that we have upstate. But I think if when you do look in the interconnection queue, there's plenty of resources. There are plenty of proposals all over the state. But certainly from a reliability standpoint, those connecting in the downstate zones in New York City in particular, those are the ones that are going to have the greater reliability value immediately. Upstate, again, as we see some of these larger loads connect to the grid, we may need to see more build out in the upstate. But again, there's the queue as of now has quite a bit of between solar, wind, and storage, quite a bit of resources proposed upstate.
Great. How much of the additional 90 gigawatts needed is required by Metro New York area? This person only saw about 6 to 7 gigawatts of additional capacity.
I don't know that we broke down the number. I think if that was referring to the 20 gigawatts we would need by 2030.
Yeah, Chris, I think that was your question, was it not? No. Let's see, who was that? Yeah, I'm not sure who asked that question. So if that did not answer your question, please type it back in again. I'm sorry.
Yeah, and I don't think that if that's the reference that's being asked about, that finding from our study didn't necessarily break down that so many of these megawatts need to be in New York City and so many megawatts need to be upstate.
Okay, just a couple more. Let's see, and then we'll stop. It's time, so I don't want to hold people up. One question was whether solar actually helps to keep the costs down for energy.
Yeah, so the way our markets work, if it's behind the meter solar, which, as I mentioned, we've got quite a bit of that out there. Behind the meter solar works to reduce the amount of demand that we have to supply with generation. So if there's 1,000 megawatts of behind the meter solar that are reducing demand, then that's 1,000 megawatts of, like I said, probably natural gas generation that we don't need to dispatch. So that solar is kind of knocking off the need for the most expensive resource that we would need to dispatch if it wasn't there. If that made sense, I hope that made sense. So when solar is behind the meter, by reducing the demand, it's effectively kind of also reducing price, because typically the higher demand on the system, the higher the price is. We have to dispatch a more expensive generator, in the way our markets work. That's what sets the price for all resources. When we're talking about grid connected solar, again, we don't have a whole lot of that yet on the system, but it's the same for wind. Both grid connected solar and wind have very little in the way of operating costs. So when they're offering into our markets, they're offering in at, oftentimes they'll offer in our market at $0, or in some cases, maybe even a negative price, so that if the sun is shining or if the wind is blowing, we're going to dispatch them because they're the least expensive resource available to the system. And again, has the same effect of, by being available to the system, they're displacing the need for some other generator, some likely fossil fuel fired generator. That's probably a long-winded answer. I think the question was relatively simple: of does solar lower the price on the wholesale grid? And the answer is yes, it does. The presence of solar will lead to lower wholesale prices during certain conditions, anyway.
Great. Donald, I think you were the one that I wasn't sure asked that previous question. So if you would like to unmute yourself and just let Gary know if you answered his question.
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Yeah. So in one of the prior slides, by 2030, 2040, statewide, we're going to require an additional threefold over what we have now, around 90 gigawatts. So how much of that, my question was, how much of that additional 90 gigawatts is required by New York City? Because the map that you showed for the additional capacity for all these additional lines to carry downstate only totals up to around 6 or 7 gigawatts. I'd have to think that Metro New York City is going to require a large chunk of that additional 90. So it doesn't seem like we have anywhere near enough expansion of capacity to New York City.
Yeah, well, offshore wind will play a big role in that, and I don't know the precise number. I don't have that, and I'd have to dig through the outlook to see whether or not it's broken down. But in terms of what resource do we expect to supply New York City? In sort of a big way, it would be offshore wind. Maybe there's some solar opportunity as well, but in terms of sort of the most significant offshore or most significant zero emitting resource for the city, it would be offshore wind.
Thank you.
All right, thanks, Gary. Just one more, and the rest, we will answer the questions offline and get them out to you so that your answers can be resolved. But the last one was with Bill Nowak. He had a question earlier and wanted to follow up. Bill, can you unmute yourself? Let me see. Oh, he may have left. I don't see him. Oh, there he is.
Hi, am I muted? Can you hear me?
No, you're fine now. Yep.
Great. Gary, thanks for the great presentation and good luck in 2024 and 2025 meeting that gap you're projecting at this point. Hopefully the power line from up north will come through and things will be good at least after that. But my question is, what is the best way to engage with NYISO as you develop your projections? We think it could be beneficial to compare some of the models and assumptions that New York Geo is working with ones NYISO is working with, and the process is kind of opaque to us. Is there somebody to be in touch with? Is there a way to participate in the process?
So the short answer is, yeah, there is a way to participate in the process. It might be easier though to take that one offline. I'm certainly, you can certainly reach out to me, and I can either follow up or put you in touch with some folks. But we do have a stakeholder process where a lot of these your modeling assumptions are discussed well in advance. So we present to our stakeholders what we're thinking in terms of how we're shaping up our load forecast. So there is a sort of that formal process, but of course you have to be a formal stakeholder or member of the stakeholder process to participate in that.
Yep.
But if you want to follow up with me directly, either email, I think Joanne has my email.
Yes, I do.
Yeah, and that might be the easiest way I can
Okay,
either
thank
get you in touch with somebody or at least get a better sense of what your question is and how who I can ask to help me answer it.
Appreciate that. Thank you. Great presentation.
Sure. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, Gary, for all of your time and jumping in at the last minute to take on this very enlightening and needed presentation. I think many people probably have a better understanding of the Herculean work ahead of you guys, but that you're really keeping on top of it and working to get it a little bit smoother and a little bit easier to get to those numbers. So like with Bill, hopefully by 2025 we'll have that the Champlain Express all set. As I said in the chat, we will have a survey, and we would appreciate you to complete. That helps us drive in which direction we need to go as far as future webinars and education and support. USIS, as you may or may not know, is a 501c3 nonprofit solar education services organization. So we provide only education. We don't